The setup for the evening is we're going to have a little talk from each person on the panel of about 5 minutes, and then we'll open up for some questions from the floor and then go back to any responses from the panel. And if we're all ready, we can start with Dr. Smith.
Thank you. Maybe if I stand and I'll just... Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, I think... yeah, there we go. Thanks. I'll just stand here. Well, firstly, thank you very much to LERN for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk broadly, I think, in support of the concept of big data. And I want to talk a little bit about biodiversity and the role of collections in big data. Is that going to work? No, it's not. We might have to just manually, I'll just cue you, Kate, if that's all right. So collections might seem at first sight kind of odd fellows to this concept of big data. Many big ideas have come from collections and our study of biodiversity, but often looking at very small collections, relatively small groups, like we've got here Darwin's finches, things like this iguanodon tooth, instrumental to our understanding of extinction, or things like a handful, a smattering of hominid fossils, really important to our understanding of human evolution. We've also, working at a big natural history museum, we have a big role to inspire the public, but often a relatively small fraction of our collection is possible to get on display. We have some very big specimens trying to convey some big ideas, but that's not necessarily big data. But behind the scenes, of course, for many of you that know the Natural History Museum or how collections operate, there is an enormous wealth of specimens. And every one of those specimens tells an important story. And if you put those stories together and start to link those stories with other kinds of information, I would argue that that is big data. Now, there are many definitions of what big data is. I think various people try. One that I'm quite fond of, and I think is a little bit imperfect, but it's not bad, is this one here. Any problem for which the value of an individual piece of data doesn't contribute significantly towards answering the question, or for which the effect size is so small that achieving statistical significance requires mass sampling. So that, for me, very much fits the definitions around biodiversity and collections as a good map to big data. And our institution is not alone in this effort of trying to share lots of data about our collections. There are about 7,000 institutions with large natural history collections worldwide. Potentially, it's estimated 1.5 to 3 billion specimens within those collections. That's quite a bit of a guess right now, but it's been grounded in at least some studies. And there are about 1 billion records through aggregators like GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is trying to pull together all the records of all the specimens. There's only about 130 million specimens. The rest are biological observations, things like birding observations, plant observations. And together, this data presents a really important picture of the natural world, both temporally and spatially, and also critically taxonomically. A lot of the focus right now is on how you mobilize our collections. How do we digitize our collections at scale and at speed to try and share this information? And there's some really big challenges in trying to do this at scale. A lot of the focus is actually on images. In many ways, images are our new data. Previously, a lot of this was done by hand, taking an enormous amount of time. Now, by taking a digital image, we can do some amazing things in terms of not only just reconstructing things like labels, which hold a lot of the information that we want to get off those specimens, but also start to extract data at huge scale, the kind of things that often we would have had PhD students laboring for many years doing. Now we can do potentially in a matter of minutes across these very large data sets. And this is also creating, at least I would argue, whole new paradigms of research in all sorts of new areas. So things to do with monitoring and measuring environmental change, research that just simply would have not been possible had we not mobilized the massive amounts of information that we have about the natural world. Citizen science, people can now contribute to this kind of science at really massive scales. all sorts of studies on biodiversity loss, and some whole new areas, things like species recognition through images, apps that fit on our mobile phones, using a vast pool of imagery to help us recognize and automate that process of recognizing species. So that really closes my argument, but I'm broadly, with some caveats, a supporter of the concept of big data as a useful term, I think, to help further our science. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastically well done. You had an extra 6 seconds spare there, if there's anything else you'd like to add. I might keep a note of how everyone does and give out a round of applause for the person who gets closest to bang on 5 minutes. Okay. So now if we can hand over to Professor Desimov.
Thank you. Okay, so it's also a joy to be part of this debate. Thank you very much for the organization. So I'm, in my lab, we're interested in sequences, in genomic sequences across many different species, and we try to find their evolutionary relationships to see, what has changed and what is still in common across really all of life. And so it's fascinating to see that some genes have virtually not changed across billions of years, and while other things, of course, we know, just looking at the diversity of life, there's obviously also a lot of adaptation and innovation in different clades. And so, I mean, what we've witnessed with all of these genetic data over the last 15 years is a massive explosion of data. When I started working on this as a PhD student, the first few genomes had been sequenced, notably the human genome. And nowadays, I mean, you have labs that routinely sequence hundreds of organisms, single labs. And so that produces a lot of data. So I think that certainly qualifies as big data. I think in addition to the volume, I think one important point also, if we are still trying to define a little bit big data, is that we have also some heterogeneity. This data that is typically aggregated from many different sources. And so this presents some challenges that I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit more. And so I'm generally a proponent of big data. I think in a way, the debate is not so much of whether we should embrace or not big data. I think the big data is there, and there are many undeniable successes. But at the same time, like any kind of like a new order or new paradigm, there are also sometimes maybe some overselling that is coming on. Is no silver bullet. And so I think, I mean, if I want to come up with maybe three, I think, fundamental challenges with big data, I think there's one which is very much with the loss of an intuition that you get when you are trying to deal with big data. I mean, as the cognitive process and the modeling is happening increasingly in computers, you kind of need to encode very explicitly all the previous knowledge. And there's very little space for, just like reacting to unexpected input, as it were. And so if you think about, the qualities that you expect from good scientists, good science, and, maybe one that is important is just wisdom. It's not only an encyclopedic knowledge about the subject matter, but it's also an ability to react to unexpected inputs and perhaps input that don't that have not been seen before. And so I think where wisdom can be put in this big data analysis, I think it is very much of a challenge. Of course, wisdom also has moral dimension, and we see it also. This may be also something that we will be able to discuss, but it's clearly something that is a challenge when the modeling is happening in computers. The second, I think, big challenge has to do with data heterogeneity. When you're aggregating data from multiple sources, it's very easy to have confounders. So I don't know how many of you know about Simpson's paradox here. Can I have a few hands? That's well, of course, we are here in a very educated society. But so Simpson's paradox, it was the classical example is given by the uptake rate in 1973 at Berkeley University. There was maybe 44% of male that were accepted and only 33% of female. And so that gave rise to like some lawsuit. But actually when they looked in every department, actually were roughly equal number, if not more, women who were admitted. And this difference was almost entirely due to the fact that women were applying to the more selective departments. As you can see how if you're looking at the data individually, you may come to some conclusion, and when you aggregate, you may have like a completely different, almost like the opposite interpretation. So it's very easy to have this type of structure, and I think big data analysis are particularly prone to this. And then the final challenge, perhaps the biggest one, is that big data is, and also the capacity of computing all this data is tempting us to go to more and more complex models. And so, and it's very difficult to argue against trying to model things more realistically. But I think it's kind of a bit futile as well, because the complexity of nature and life is enormous, and the amount of data, whether they are big or not, actually is infinitesimal compared to this complexity. And so actually, you cannot, even with enormous amount of data, you cannot really have models that have any sort of real realism. What you need to think of are models that are predictive for particular purposes, but that, I think, requires a big shift, because now we're not trying to model things in an absolute, try to describe nature. We have to think about the goal of what is it that we're doing. And I think this is a very different way of approaching a problem, certainly something that is, I think, even really within practitioners, something that is difficult to push back against. So I think maybe this is also something that we could be discussing.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. You went 51 seconds over.
Oh my God.
Okay, brilliant. And now would like to pass over to Professor Jones.
Thanks. Hold on. Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation. So I was trying to think about big data in my work. So I'm a biodiversity scientist, and I look at large-scale trends in biodiversity and how biodiversity is declining, and how we can try to mitigate that effects and understand what the future will bring and how that impacts on human health and well-being. So trends like these are kind of state of the planet trends. So the top left ones with the big circles on are kind of our measure of the state of biodiversity in the planet. So then we have the pressures which are ongoing. So these are in the second column, which is the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the number of people. The response, the benefits we're getting from biodiversity are also declining, but our responses, fortunately, are increasing. So I use these kinds of trends to understand what's happening on the planet and whether we can predict what's going to happen next. So the problem with these trends and these kinds of data is that they need a lot of information. And so the historical problem has been that there's very little data in order to make significant analyses like this. So, for example, for the climate models, they have a climate weather station every couple of kilometres across this country, and that's a huge amount of data that they're processing. And from my perspective, that's been a really big challenge in my work, in that I haven't been able to get access to these kinds of data. So my work has been trying to access these data, get more data in so we can build these kinds of models. And then my challenge really has been, I've got all this big data and I don't know what to do with it or how to analyze it. So those are the big challenges that we've been facing, and that I've been focusing a lot of my work and energy on solving those problems. And I'm just going to give you an example from one of my projects. So this is, I really like bats, if you don't know that, but bats are cool. So we had a big citizen science program across Eurasia where we stuck microphones on top of cars and got participants and volunteers to drive around with the microphone on top of their cars collecting data. So this is audio data that the bats are making. So bats leak information about themselves into the environment, and so you can, by monitoring their soundscapes, you can understand how populations are declining and where they are and what threats they face. So we had loads of data, and I thought, this is amazing, we've got loads of data. And then I was like, oh no, how on earth are we going to analyze this? So I had to work quite closely with computer scientists, engineers, to understand how to turn these petabytes of data that I had from these surveys into something meaningful. So we've been working on this is a data pipeline from getting the raw audio data and then processing that. So this is a back call that you can actually see see on the screen in a spectrogram, so it'd be an ultrasonic call, and then using these new tools, machine learning tools, to process this information. So we're using deep learning networks to actually understand what species are there and what bats are present and what they're doing. So then you can kind of go even further, and this is a new project I have in the Olympic Park. So the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, we've got these new sensors which have got microchips inside the sensor which do all the processing on them. So you just put them out and then they tell you what species there are and how many bats are present. So you've got vast amounts of data. So I'm talking vast amounts. So this is over 3 months. These are on constantly. This is the size of the circle is the amount of bats present in the park around each sensor. So sensor 7 is a legend. There's a bat roost by it. We didn't know that before. So you can start to look at these things. So I guess I had no data. I wanted to get loads of data. Now I've got more data that I could possibly know what to do with. I've had to work closely in a cross-disciplinary way to understand how to develop new tools outside my experience with computer scientists to be able to understand how to deal with this data. And then I thought, oh, great, we've solved that. That's brilliant. But now when we're getting this massive amounts of data in, the gap between management decisions, conservation management decisions, using these data is vast. So it's out of the experience and understanding of a lot of the ecological managers of the park, well, not this park, but a lot of parks. So how do you bridge that gap between some very high-tech tools and very high-tech sensors producing vast amounts of data, and what are you doing it for? Because the park managers have very little understanding, and actually I have very little understanding of how to use that to make conservation decisions. So I think that's the really big challenge of big data is it's not just the tools that you need to analyze it, but the gap between conservation decision-making or just decision-making and management. Okay, that's it.
Okay, and we're going to go over to Dr. Pound now.
Hi, good evening. I'm in psychology, in behavioural science, mostly looking at the behaviour of humans. I don't work with data sets that are quite as large as those that are being used in some of the biological sciences. So perhaps I'm sometimes looking at data on the incidence of crime with maybe a few 100,000 or sometimes a few million crime incidents in those files. But this evening I didn't want to talk specifically about my work. I just wanted to talk a bit about some of the challenges we face in psychology in relation to big data. Now, my preferred definition of big data is where there's so much data, it's so difficult to count, we can forget about arguments about whether the term data is singular or plural, or we can just use it as a mass noun. So that's my definition of big data. In psychology, it usually means things like data arising from large surveys, perhaps the census, from public services like the NHS, from the police force, but increasingly nowadays from what's become known as found data. That's data arising from your internet activity, social network usage, credit card transactions, Oyster card usage, mobile phone location and movement data, that sort of thing. And all these data sources, they offer some fantastic opportunities for us to really gain some interesting insights into human behaviour. But I just wanted to draw attention to some of the issues that have arisen in this area. I think in the enthusiasm for size, the fact that bigger isn't always better has sometimes been missed in relation to these sorts of found data. I mean, if you speak to the security services, in terms of their mission to try and find, for example, evidence of terrorist activity in large data sets, they say it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, and the solution is not always to build a bigger haystack. Sometimes planned sampling is better than allowing a large random sample to emerge on its own. And the classic example of this will be in the city of Boston. Some of you may have heard of, anyone heard of the Boston Street Bump app? The Boston city authorities thought it would be a good way to try and locate potholes and road defects by using a smartphone app where phone accelerometers and GPS transceivers would report back on the location of all the jolts that people experienced as they drove around the city. And they ended up with a fantastically detailed map of all the potholes on the streets frequented by young, affluent people with smartphones. So all the poorer neighbourhoods, the streets didn't get the attention they needed. And in the end, the city had to send out city workers with the smartphone app to actually properly sample the city's streets. So you can get all sorts of problems like that. And in my own work, I'm very mindful of the fact that when we're looking at crime records, we're looking at the crimes that the police bothered to detect and record, not thousands of crimes that never made it into the data set. Also, you know, there's this feeling among really, really big data enthusiasts in the field of human behaviour that somehow the truth is going to emerge from a data set when it's sufficiently large. We don't need to worry about randomised controlled experiments because the truth will just come out from these correlations that we observe. And that's, you know, it's a problematic assumption. I don't think randomised controlled experiments will ever be fully replaced. And I mean, the classic example of a failure in this area is Google flu trends. You may remember from probably even nearly 10 years ago now, Google announced triumphantly that they could track the spread of flu during the flu season based on what terms people were searching for, things like cold, fever, tissue, or whatever. And it correlated really, really well with the CDC data on the incidence of flu across the United States for a couple of flu seasons, and then the correlation just broke down. So they had a huge amount of information about what people were doing, and they knew it correlated with the incidence of flu, but they didn't really know why, and the whole correlation broke down, and it's been quietly withdrawn as far as I know. Then there's the issue of quality. Unlike when people looking at biological specimens and data arising from careful laboratory work, a lot of the data we have to look at in psychology arises from, you know, people doing things, people recording things, police officers recording crimes or not recording them or recording them incorrectly. And a lot of it comes from, you know, audit data that services collect. And people, unlike biological specimens, behave differently when they know they're being monitored and when they know data's being recorded. So the classic example you're probably all familiar with would be the situation with A&E waiting time targets. All the A&E departments have a target to try and treat or admit people within 4 hours. And if you find yourself in an A&E department just waiting for the results of a blood test, at 3 hours and 55 minutes, they will usher you into a hospital bed and admit you to the hospital for no other reason than to meet the waiting time target. So now you will show up in a large data set of hospital admissions because the people knew that their activity was going to be monitored and form part of a data set. So, you know, when you're monitoring people, you have strange issues like that. And one final thing I'd just like to mention is, in psychology, we have a bit of a problem with repeatability for some experimental findings. And one of the ways to deal with this is much more openness with regard to the data we've collected. And one of the problems I foresee is as more and more very large data sets are made more and more open, more and more people are going to start mining them to death, and we're going to get more and more false positives which can't be replicated. Statistically significant but incredibly tiny effects that show up when you let thousands of researchers loose with powerful statistical software on these very, very large data sets to test 1 million hypotheses per second, as it were. So that's one of the things that concerns me. But aside from all those, I'm very enthusiastic about big data.
Thank you very much.